In 1924, the United States government made a horrifying discovery. Half the Navy's entire emergency oil reserve had vanished. Not stolen by a foreign government, not taken by a criminal syndicate, handed away by the man President Harding trusted most. The U.S. Secretary of the Interior had secretly sold America's oil and pocketed $400,000 in cash to do it. That's over $7 million in today's money, delivered in black bags and cattle crates to avoid detection. The man's name was Albert Bacon Fall. He had been confirmed to his position unanimously by the U.S. Senate. His own colleagues called him the best man in the cabinet. He had been investigated 0 times. Nobody was looking. Here's how one man looted the U.S. government's most critical military asset and nearly got away with it completely. But to understand how he pulled it off, we need to go back to 1921. Warren G. Harding won the 1920 presidential election by the largest popular vote margin in U.S. history. America was exhausted from World War I. They wanted normalcy. They wanted prosperity. They wanted someone who looked like a president. Harding looked exactly like a president. Tall, silver-haired, charming, and almost completely unqualified. He knew it too. He once told a friend, "I am not fit for this office." But he filled his cabinet with men he trusted personally. Men from his poker circle. Men from his home state of Ohio. Men like Albert Fall. Fall was a self-made New Mexico rancher turned senator. Rough, confident, and politically connected. He'd built his reputation as a tough-talking Westerner who got things done. Harding loved him. The Senate confirmed Fall as Interior Secretary without a single opposing vote. That had almost never happened before. But here's where the story gets interesting. Albert Fall didn't just want to run the Interior Department. He wanted to control America's oil. In the early 1920s, oil wasn't just fuel. Oil was military power. The U.S. Navy had recently converted its entire fleet from coal to oil. Without oil, the Navy couldn't move. Without the Navy, America couldn't defend itself. The government knew this. So they had set aside 3 massive oil fields specifically for the Navy, emergency reserves to be used only in wartime. One was in Elk Hills, California. One was in Buena Vista Hills, California. And one was beneath a rock formation in Wyoming that looked like a teapot. That one was called Teapot Dome. These fields were controlled by the Navy Department, not the Interior Department. That meant they were outside Albert Fall's reach. Until Fall made one phone call. He called his friend Edwin Denby, the Secretary of the Navy. He told Denby the oil reserves would be better managed under Interior. Denby, who was famously described as not the sharpest tool in the shed, agreed immediately. Fall then drafted an executive order transferring control of the reserves. Harding signed it without reading the details. Just like that, Albert Fall controlled the U.S. Navy's entire emergency oil supply. This happened in May 1921. Congress wasn't told. The Navy's own admirals weren't consulted. The American public had no idea. And now Fall started making calls to his real friends. Edward Doheny was one of the richest oil men in America. He had made his fortune drilling in California and Mexico. He and Fall had been friends for 30 years. Fall contacted Doheny in November 1921. He told him the Elk Hills Reserve was now available for private lease. No competitive bidding, no public announcement, no congressional approval, just a handshake between old friends. Doheny sent his son to Washington shortly after that meeting. His son carried a black bag. Inside that black bag was $100,000 in cash. That's $1.7 million in today's money. He handed it personally to Albert Fall. Fall later claimed it was a personal loan from a close friend. The second deal was with Harry Sinclair. Sinclair was another oil tycoon, flashy and politically connected. Fall leased him the entire Teapot Dome reserve. Sinclair sent his payments differently. He sent cash through intermediaries. He sent Liberty bonds delivered in a black bag. He sent a herd of cattle delivered to Fall's New Mexico ranch. He even sent an employee to work Fall's ranch for free. In total, Fall collected roughly $400,000 from both men. In exchange, they got exclusive rights to drill America's military oil reserves. Reserves that had been set aside to defend the country in wartime, now being pumped for private profit. And for almost 2 years, nobody outside that circle knew anything. The leases were filed quietly. The transfers were buried in paperwork. Fall continued attending cabinet meetings, shaking hands, being photographed. He looked completely clean. The one man in Wyoming was already asking questions, and he wasn't going to stop. By 1922, Albert Fall was living like a different man. For years, his Three Rivers Ranch in New Mexico had been struggling. Debts piling up, fences falling down, the property slowly deteriorating under financial pressure. Then suddenly, everything changed. New fences appeared across the entire property. New outbuildings went up almost overnight. A new herd of cattle arrived, over 500 animals. Irrigation systems were installed across hundreds of acres. The ranch was completely transformed within months. Fall told his neighbors his fortunes had simply improved. He didn't elaborate. Nobody pressed him. This was New Mexico in 1922. Rich men had always found ways to get richer. And in Washington, Albert Fall was untouchable. He moved through the Capitol like a man who owned it. And in some ways, he did. He had the ear of the president. He had the trust of the cabinet. He had just quietly executed one of the most audacious land grabs in American history, and the press loved him. The Wall Street Journal ran a glowing profile praising the oil lease deals. They called it a triumph of efficient resource management. Industry groups sent letters of congratulation. Oil executives toasted his name at private dinners. Harry Sinclair threw lavish parties at his estate in New Jersey. Fall attended as a guest of honor. Edward Doheny hosted banquets in California. Fall was always at the table. These were men at the absolute peak of American capitalism, connected, celebrated, and completely above suspicion. Meanwhile, the investors and citizens who owned those oil reserves had no idea. Ordinary Americans paid taxes that funded those fields. The Navy built its entire strategic war plan around that oil. Admirals had specifically requested those reserves be kept untouched for national emergencies. Now the oil was being pumped out as fast as possible for private profit. But Fall wasn't worried. He had covered his tracks carefully. The executive order transferring the reserves had been signed legally. The leases were on file at the Interior Department. Everything looked bureaucratically legitimate. Fall had learned something important about power. The best corruption doesn't look like corruption. It looks like paperwork. Back in Washington, President Harding's administration was entering its peak. The economy was booming. The stock market was climbing. America was entering the roaring 20s at full speed. Harding was popular. His cabinet appeared competent. Fall appeared to be one of its stars. In 1922, he was mentioned in newspapers as a potential presidential candidate. Think about that for a moment. The man secretly selling America's military oil reserves was being talked about for the White House. He was 61 years old and felt invincible. The cracks were already forming. In April 1922, the Wall Street Journal published a small item, almost a footnote. It noted that the Teapot Dome Reserve had been leased to Harry Sinclair's company. No competitive bidding, no explanation. The item was buried on an inside page. Most readers ignored it, but one reader did not. Senator John B. Kendrick of Wyoming read it over breakfast. Teapot Dome was in his state. He knew those fields had been set aside for the Navy. He sent a formal inquiry to the Interior Department that same day. Fall's office replied with a form letter. Nothing to see here. Kendrick wasn't satisfied. He passed the inquiry to a colleague on the Senate Public Lands Committee. That colleague was Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. La Follette was one of the most aggressive investigators in Senate history. He smelled something, and he handed the file to the most relentless senator in Washington, Thomas Walsh of Montana. Walsh was a former lawyer, methodical, patient, and absolutely tireless. He would spend the next 2 years quietly pulling on every thread. Fall didn't know Walsh was coming. He was too busy planning the next phase of his life. In late 1922, Albert Fall made a decision that surprised everyone in Washington. He resigned as Interior Secretary. He told Harding he wanted to return to private life. He told colleagues he missed New Mexico. What he didn't say was that Harry Sinclair had already offered him a job, a very well-paid private consulting job, in the oil industry. Fall left Washington in March 1923 feeling completely safe. He had the money. He had the ranch. He had powerful friends. And as far as he knew, nobody was looking. He was wrong. Thomas Walsh had already requested every document related to the Teapot Dome lease. Every single one. And somewhere in that mountain of paperwork was a number that didn't add up. Thomas Walsh worked slowly, methodically. For nearly a year, he reviewed thousands of pages of Interior Department documents, lease agreements, transfer orders, correspondence between Fall and the oil companies. Most of it looked clean on the surface. Fall had been careful, but Walsh kept circling back to one question. How did Albert Fall's failing ranch suddenly transform overnight? Where did the money come from? In the summer of 1923, something else happened that changed everything. President Warren G. Harding died suddenly in San Francisco. Official cause, a heart attack. He was 57 years old. America mourned. But inside Washington, something else was happening. Harding's closest advisors knew the administration was rotting from within. Corruption scandals were beginning to surface across multiple departments. Harding had reportedly told friends he was being betrayed by the men he trusted. He died before the worst of it became public. Calvin Coolidge became president, and Walsh kept digging. In November 1923, the Senate investigation went public. Walsh called his first witnesses. The early testimony was dry, technical, bureaucratic shuffling of paperwork between departments. The press barely covered it. Then Walsh called Albert Fall. Fall arrived at the Senate hearing room looking calm and confident. He testified that the oil leases were completely legitimate. He said the transfers were necessary for national security. He said he had acted entirely in the public interest. Senators listened politely. Fall left feeling like he had handled it perfectly. He hadn't, because Walsh had found the number. Buried in New Mexico property records was a simple fact. Albert Fall had paid off $100,000 in back taxes and debts in 1922. Cash. All at once. On a government salary of $12,000 a year. Walsh put that number in front of Fall's neighbors, his bankers, and his contractors. Every one of them confirmed it. The ranch renovation was real. The cattle were real. The cash was real, and it had all appeared immediately after the oil leases were signed. Walsh went back to Fall for an explanation. Fall's story kept changing. First, he said he had borrowed the money from a newspaper publisher named Edward McLean. Walsh tracked down McLean immediately. McLean was vacationing in Palm Beach. Walsh traveled there personally. McLean broke under questioning within minutes. He admitted he had never given Fall any money. The story was a lie. Fall was now caught in a direct contradiction under Senate testimony. Back in Washington, the press finally woke up. Teapot Dome was suddenly front-page news across the country. Walsh then called Edward Doheny. Doheny made a catastrophic decision. He decided to get ahead of the story. He voluntarily admitted sending his son to Washington with $100,000 in cash. He insisted it was a personal loan to an old friend, not a bribe. The country erupted. The image of a black bag stuffed with $100,000 being hand-delivered to a cabinet secretary became the defining image of the scandal. Newspapers ran it for weeks. Walsh then turned to Harry Sinclair. Sinclair refused to cooperate. He refused to answer questions. He literally left the country and traveled to Europe with his thoroughbred racing horses. The Senate held him in contempt. Sinclair returned, and then made his second catastrophic mistake. He hired a private detective agency to surveil members of the jury during his criminal trial. He was caught. He served 6 months in prison. Not for the oil fraud, but for jury tampering and contempt of Congress. Albert Fall's defenses collapsed one by one. The false alibi was gone. The cash deliveries were confirmed. The timing was undeniable. In 1929, Albert Bacon Fall was convicted of accepting a bribe. He became the first United States cabinet member in history to be convicted of a crime committed while in office. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $100,000 fine. He was broke. His ranch was gone. His political career was destroyed. He arrived at the New Mexico State Penitentiary in a wheelchair. The man who had once been called the best in the cabinet was carried into prison by guards. Edward Doheny, the man who paid the bribe, was acquitted. The man who took the bribe went to prison. The man who gave it walked free. America took notice of that contradiction. It would not forget it. Albert Fall served 9 months of his 1-year sentence. He was released early due to poor health. He went back to New Mexico a broken man. His ranch had been seized to pay legal debts. He lived out his final years in a small El Paso apartment, nearly penniless. He died in 1944 with almost nothing to his name. The man who sold America's oil reserves couldn't afford a decent funeral. Edward Doheny never recovered either, not emotionally. His son, the young man who delivered that black bag to Fall, had been charged alongside his father. Before the trial concluded, Doheny's son was shot dead. His closest friend pulled the trigger and then turned the gun on himself. Nobody ever fully explained why. Doheny was acquitted weeks later. He lived another decade, but people who knew him said he was never the same. Harry Sinclair rebuilt his oil empire. His company eventually became part of what we know today as ARCO. He donated a wing to a hospital. He bought more racehorses. He died wealthy in 1956. Some men pay a price, some don't. The oil itself, the whole point of the scheme, was mostly gone. Millions of barrels had already been pumped from Teapot Dome by the time the leases were canceled. The Navy never fully recovered those reserves. The emergency supply that American admirals had specifically protected for wartime use was depleted for private profit. During World War II, America faced genuine oil supply challenges. Historians have debated ever since whether Teapot Dome made that worse. But the scandal left something behind more durable than oil. It changed American government permanently. Congress used Teapot Dome to assert something it had never fully claimed before: the right to investigate the executive branch, the right to subpoena cabinet officials, the right to drag the president's men into a hearing room and demand answers. That precedent did not disappear. In 1973, Senate investigators used the exact same legal framework established during Teapot Dome to investigate Richard Nixon. The Watergate hearings were constitutionally possible in part because Thomas Walsh had sat in a Senate hearing room 50 years earlier and refused to accept a form letter as an answer. One senator's stubbornness in 1922 made presidential accountability in 1973 legally possible. That's how history actually works. Not in dramatic moments, in paperwork, in property records, in a number that didn't add up on a ranch in New Mexico. Albert Fall thought he had built the perfect crime, buried in bureaucracy, hidden in executive orders, protected by powerful friends. But he forgot one thing: someone is always watching, and somewhere there is always a number that doesn't add up. Teapot Dome didn't just expose one corrupt cabinet secretary. It permanently established that in America, no one in government is above investigation. And that's how one man's greed changed the rules of American power forever.